Welcome back to Bible 101. I'm your host, Eric Williams. I'm the rector of St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Rochester, Michigan, and it's my pleasure to offer this class. I will give a caveat. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I am someone who fell in love with the Bible when I was in seminary and love sharing insights about the Bible, love reading the Bible and studying. My favorite classes in seminary were studying Greek and Hebrew and studying the scriptures themselves. And I have tried in all of my years of ministry to share insights with people, to do Bible studies. And this class is really not so much a Bible study as it is an overview, sort of a 30,000-foot view of the Bible. So each month, we're going to take a different angle. Last month, we looked at how the Bible was written. What were the original sources? How was it compiled? How was it translated? How did it come to us in the way that we received the Bible? What was the long and fascinating process of how that worked? You can catch that video on our website, stpfeeds.org. All these classes will be offered in person and also on videos that you can access anytime. And I welcome you to send questions. I'll have my email up at the end of this presentation. This month, we're going to be looking at the history, both in the Bible, there's a lot of history in the Bible, but also the history behind the Bible. When we read the Bible passages on Sunday mornings, we get them out of context. We don't really see how they fit together. When was this happening? What was going on in the world around those events? And so I find it really helpful to look at the history. It gives us a lot more insight into the passages themselves and a way of helping us to interpret them in our day, knowing what the original context at least might have been. There's a lot of things we don't know about the history in and behind the Bible, but we will do our best to find out what we can. So let me start the slides here. So as I said, our topic this month is the history in and behind the Bible. And first, we have to look for the sources. What are the sources that we have for that history? The sources are, first, archaeological excavations. So archaeologists are always discovering things that give us insights into the events around the time that the biblical stories were taking place or were written down. And remember, there's a gap usually, the events, and then they're written down sometimes much, much later. And so archaeology can help us kind of find out. But the problem is there's not a lot of that evidence. So it would be great if we had tons of sort of proof of the events that happened. Instead, very often we're relying on the second source for biblical history, which is the Bible itself, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. That is our primary source, really, for the history in and behind the Bible. And we can make inferences about what was happening based on those stories. And again, those stories are written sometimes much, much later. Sometimes they're written with a particular point of view, and they don't always exactly give us the answers that we're looking for if we're approaching the Bible as historians. And then sometimes, and again, this is somewhat rare, there are texts that are found outside that give insight into what was going on. We'll talk later about Josephus, who was a Jewish historian who was writing in the first century. And so we can get some insights about the New Testament events from the perspective of an outsider, Josephus, and that gives us corroborating evidence. The earliest mention we have of anything outside the Bible is this really fascinating stone obelisk. It's called the Merniptah Stele, Stele, which just means a stone on which things are written. It was a way of commemorating important events. And in this case, it was erected by King Merniptah, who was the pharaoh of Egypt after important victories that he had over the Libyans. But at the bottom of this, there's like 28 lines of hieroglyphics, and the last 3 lines relate to a different conquest when he was battling in Canaan, which was then part of imperial Egypt. The borders were changing all the time as different kingdoms rose and fell. And one of the hieroglyphics, many scholars believe, relates to Israel. So it would be the first outside reference to Israel that we have in the ancient world. And so that's the kind of thing that often that we're looking for and not always can find. But this is one of those possibly, maybe, probably mentions at least that there was a people of Israel that's mentioned outside the pages of the Bible itself. When we think about the prehistory of Israel, we're really talking about a very, very long period ago. The earliest civilization that any archaeologist has been able to find is the settlement in Jericho. We think of Jericho as the old gospel song, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. In fact, when we went to the Holy Land, several of us, we visited Jericho and we found out there had been many Jerichos, different sites. And so the site that they found that was 9,000 BCE, think about that, 11,000 years ago, there were people living in Jericho. Those were, that's in Palestine. That's in the area that eventually got settled by the people who later became known as the Hebrews. We don't know who those people were, 9,000 BCE. The modern Jericho is in a different spot, and they've never actually found the Jericho of the biblical story from Genesis with, or Joshua, with Joshua marching around the walls and them falling down. We haven't found that Jericho necessarily. So you see the complexity of archaeological excavations and discovery. There were ancient cultures that flourished mostly in places where there were river floodplains. That created the optimal environment for agriculture, and it's agriculture that led to the creation of civilization. Before that, we had wandering groups of hunter-gatherers, but it was agriculture that allowed civilization actually to take hold. And those ancient civilizations grew up in China, in Mesopotamia, and we'll see a map of that in a second, and in Egypt. So Egypt, the Nile River would flood, and that's how agriculture started. In Mesopotamia, it was the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and in China, a similar pattern. The Sumerians were the group that established the first city-states in Mesopotamia. And as far as we know, they had polytheistic religion, which meant they worshiped many gods. They were tied, of course, to this agricultural cycle. If there was a drought, they died. And so they came to invest the forces of nature with divine powers, and they would placate them and ask for, seasonable weather and good rain. I think of some of our harvest festivals in Christianity as kind of a carryover of this idea from the ancient world that we're really at the mercy of nature. And so the polytheistic ancient religions kind of looked at many, many different gods that they would placate. Of course, the Egyptians had many gods that they invested with. There was the god of the underworld. There was all the different Egyptian pantheon. And then, of course, the Greeks and Romans had their own polytheistic religion as well. As far as we know, the ancestors of the Israelites, the Hebrews, migrated to Palestine from Mesopotamia over a long period. That gets captured in a way in the story of Abraham in Genesis. When we come to Genesis, we have an interesting challenge as historians because Genesis includes stories that go all the way back to the creation of the universe, right? It's not things that were in living memory. It wasn't that someone was an eyewitness. It wasn't a journalist writing down what was happening. These were oral traditions, often referred to as myths, of the creation of the world, the flood story, the ancient stories of Abraham. And these are only getting written down around 1000 BCE, but the events happened hundreds, if not thousands, or in the case of creation, millions of years before they were ever written down. And so these are oral traditions, stories, legends, myths that the people of Israel passed down to always answer these questions. My Old Testament professor said that the book of Genesis is really the answer to the question, why are things the way they are? Picture a grandfather talking to his grandchild, and the grandchild's like, hey, Grandpa, why are things the way they are? Why do we have to work so hard? Well, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, we lived in Eden and paradise and everything was provided for us. But then we disobeyed God and we got kicked out of the garden. And ever since then, we've had to work for a living and we've had to sweat and toil. Think of Genesis as a way of using theology, our understanding of God, to explain our relationship with God, with each other, and with nature itself. Modern readers struggle sometimes with these sort of legendary stories. We think of stories like, how could all the animals fit on one boat? I know there's a guy in like Tennessee who's built a museum proving that the ark was true and factual. And you may have visited that ark, but to me, that's the wrong way of approaching it. For many modern readers, they actually give up on religion because they can't handle the legendary or miraculous nature of some of these stories. And so you get two extremes, right? You get the Noah's Ark guy in Tennessee who's like, religion is true. All the Bible must be factual and true and exactly how it happened, word for word, inerrant. And therefore we can't trust science because science is casting doubt on this truth of the religion. So you got that kind of attitude. On the other side, you got the scientific attitude, which says science is the only real truth and religion is just a bunch of made up, untrue myths. And so you have a kind of war going on, intellectual war between science and religion. Well, I have to say, as Episcopalians, we don't pick a side in this battle, right? We take a third way, as many thoughtful Christians do. I was thinking of Francis Collins, who ran the NIH for a number of years, who's a devout Christian and a very renowned scientist. And he, like many, has been able to kind of navigate this third way. And I think it's really important for us as we look at the Bible to really think about that. What does it mean and how do we do it? Factual is not the same as true, right? These stories were written. Think of the story of Adam and Eve. Was there an actual Adam and Eve? The literalists would say yes. I say probably not. But what is the question that story is trying to answer? The question is, hey, Grandpa, how did we get to be the way we are? Why is life so difficult? Well, let me tell you a story. It really is a true story about human beings being disobedient to God, having everything given to them by God, all the abundance of life. It's a story in a way that repeats in our own lives over and over. Nurtured and cherished as children, we go our wayward way, we disobey God, and we find ourselves in difficulty. The story of Genesis is really a true story, but it's a true story religiously, morally, theologically, and not necessarily a factual story. Genesis, I like to say, was not written as a science textbook. And if we read it as a science textbook, we do a disservice both to science and to religion. So let's look at some of those stories from Genesis. We're going to kind of look through some of the books of the Bible and try to unpack some of the history that was going on within them. The first major, and actually the bulk of the story of Genesis is the story of what we call the patriarchs. The patriarchs are the family that God chooses to become a new tribe, a new people to bear witness to this new faith. And so Genesis 11 and 12 tell the story of Abram, as he was called at that time. Many of the characters, when they enter into a relationship with God, receive a new name. They're renamed. So Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai becomes Sarah, Jacob becomes Israel, and so on and so forth. You see that as a pattern that repeats even into the New Testament, where Saul becomes Paul. It's a way of showing this transformation. Well, Abram is minding his own business one day. He's living over here in Ur of the Chaldeans. This is part of Mesopotamia. The Fertile Crescent, as I was mentioning, this area of Mesopotamia is that area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, perfect for agriculture and the rise of civilization. Well, for whatever reason, I don't know if he was unhappy with life in Ur, but God reaches out to him and says, Abram, I want you to follow me, and I want you to be the ancestor, the father of a new people that I'm going to create, and I will bless you if you follow me, and I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in heaven and the grains of sand on the seashore. And Abram says, sounds good, let's go. And so he leaves Ur with his family, his father Terah, and his uh, brother-in-law, I think it is, Lot, and their families, and they wander. And so many, many chapters of wandering, and eventually they're in Haran, way up here, in what's, I don't know if that's Syria or not, it's close. And then eventually they come down to Palestine and settle in Shechem. And the story there you can read about, but it's a transformational story. Did it happen exactly as the Bible says? Well, there were no eyewitnesses, but this was the legendary story of the foundation of the people of Israel. This is the start of the journey of God calling this chosen people, and Abraham becomes this ancestor, not only to the Jewish people, but also to Christians and eventually also to Muslims, because he has two sons, Isaac, who becomes the ancestor of Judaism, and Ishmael, who becomes the ancestor of Muslims. And so all these three religions trace their origin to Abraham. We don't know the dates exactly of when these things happen. Remember, these are legends being passed down, stories being passed down over many, many centuries. Many scholars think that the events of Genesis most likely fit between the years of 2000 to 1700 BCE, somewhere in that range. It's when we start hearing the name Hebrew, which is often associated by scholars with a name that we see in Mesopotamia and Egypt, Habiru, which could be a tribe, or it could be just a nickname for outsiders, wanderers who wander in. So this could be a group that had kind of wandered around and now they're wandering again. We get that with the story of Abraham's family as wanderers. And so they become known as the wanderers, the Hebrews, the Habiru. And eventually, as I mentioned, Jacob, who is the grandson of Abraham, he is given the name Israel, which means he struggled with God. He gets that name after he wrestles with the angel. There's a whole long saga about his life. So Israel then becomes his name, but because his 12 sons become the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel, all of the people of Israel, and eventually even the nation of Israel, receive that same name, or called by his name, Israel. And that's a key part of the self-understanding of the Jewish people down to this day. So what was the religion of these patriarchs, we call them, the founders? Well, Abram was probably a polytheist, right? He was living in Mesopotamia, and when he was in Ur and then in Haran, he probably worshiped like everybody else, all these other gods, but then he enters into a covenant with God, and this becomes the hallmark of the religion of the Hebrew Bible and of the New Testament. In fact, that's why we call it the Old Testament and the New Testament. Old Covenant, New Covenant. Covenant is the key word, and that's what is the crucial piece of Abram's relationship with God, is that they enter into a covenant. In those days, it was a big deal. He called it cutting a covenant, right? We just sign a paper, but in those days, they would slaughter animals. And there's this wonderful story in Genesis about Abram slaughters these animals, and he puts the halves of each animal on, and then he walks through, and a smoking torch walks with him mystically as the presence of God. And so God and Abram cut this covenant together and make this relationship. We also find in Genesis many names for God, and they probably relate to the old clan gods, that as the people come to a deeper understanding of God, they say, oh, all these other names, they really weren't separate gods. They're all referring to this same God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of all the names that are given for God in the Hebrew Bible, the two most important are Elohim, which simply means God, is translated God. So whenever you're reading along in Genesis and you see God, it's most likely Elohim, not always, but almost certainly it's Elohim. And there were several writers whose works were edited together into Genesis. By tradition, Moses wrote it all, but scholars now think there were many sources. Well, the source that uses the name God, um, Elohim, comes to be known as the E writer. So you can sort of see his version of the story when you're reading about God, God, God. The second most important name, or the second most common name, I shouldn't say, they're both important. Second most common name is Yahweh, um, which can also be written Jehovah. Remember, as we learned last month, there were no vowels in the Hebrew originally. They had to be added later. And so Yahweh and Jehovah are the same name. That name was considered so holy. This is the one that Moses asked, who am I following here? Who am I talking to? And God said, I am who I am. I will be who I will be. That gets recorded as YHWH, Yahweh. That writer, whenever you see the Lord, so Jews wouldn't say Yahweh. It was too holy a name. They wouldn't even write it, but they would use the Lord instead, Adonai. So Adonai is like a euphemism for Yahweh. And so if you're reading in the Bible and you see the Lord, the Lord, the Lord, you're probably reading a different version, right? The Elohim, God, 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 and the Yahweh, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. Those are probably two different versions that were then edited together, and we'll talk more about that in a future class. There are a bunch of other names given for God, including El Shaddai, El Elyon, El Olam, El Roy, God of the heights, God of majesty. There's all different sort of titles and names, and these probably, again, relate to older names for what were considered different gods that now are being applied to Elohim, to Yahweh, to the one God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this we see as really a religious development, a progress in the Hebrew Bible. So, in many places in the Hebrew Bible, we still see references to what we call polytheism. This is, again, the worship of many gods, often nature gods. We see this in Genesis and First Kings, even. There's lots of references to that. When Jacob, there's a long story where he marries Leah and then Rachel. When they're leaving his father-in-law, finally, and they're getting out of town in a hurry because Jacob and Laban were always kind of trying to swindle each other. Rachel brings her household gods, right? So she is a follower of Yahweh, but she hasn't given up her household gods. And so polytheism is kind of lurking there in the Hebrew Bible, and part of the life of the people of Israel and the surrounding countries for many, many centuries. This gives way to a sort of middle step in the development of theology of the Hebrew people, and that is henotheism. And this is the idea that, yeah, there's all these other gods, but Yahweh's the best God. He's number one. That's the God that we really think is head and shoulders above the other ones. The other ones are like lesser, and now we have one real, true God. But these other gods are still kind of there. And you see that referred to in places like Deuteronomy and Psalm 135. I think that's the one that says God takes his place in the council of the heavens, right? So there's all these divine beings, but our God, Yahweh, is the head of like the chairman of the board, let's say, of all these other gods. But eventually, in the Hebrew Bible, we come to what is the defining characteristic of Jewish faith and religion, and that is monotheism. And this is the idea that really gets first and most completely articulated in Isaiah, and we'll see when, that in fact there are no other gods, that what people thought were gods were just idols. They were just wood and stone. There was no divinity in them at all. And the only God who has ever been and will ever be is Yahweh. And we have a special relationship with that God, and we're the ones to share that good news with the world, to be a light to the nations. Monotheism becomes the defining characteristic of Judaism, of Christianity, and of Islam, the three Abrahamic religions that all trace their origin to Abraham. All of them hold to this theological idea over and against all the other nations who had still polytheistic ideas. And this actually gets them in trouble because, for example, by the first century, the Roman emperors are declaring that they themselves are gods and that to be a good citizen of Rome, you have to worship the emperor. And the Jews and Christians are like, no, we cannot. And there's persecution that probably arises from that fact. Because the Romans were very tolerant of everyone's religion. You could have whatever religion you wanted, as long as you also worshiped the emperor. And that was the road that the Jews and Christians refused to go down, and as a result, suffered persecution. As we come to the end of Genesis, there's the great story of Joseph. Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, ends up a prisoner in Egypt. And then through his ability to interpret dreams, his God-given ability, he comes to the notice of Pharaoh and eventually rises to become the second most powerful person in Egypt. Again, there's no Egyptian records of this, but that's the story as told in Genesis. But then things shift dramatically when we begin the book of Exodus. And it begins with the ominous words, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph." And this new Pharaoh was very suspicious of the growth of the Hebrew people. They were getting wealthier and more powerful. They were becoming a threat. It's kind of the idea of the outsiders. We see that politics going on in our own country, suspicion of immigrants, and that was part of the Egyptian view of the Hebrews. And so they become slaves. Basically, Pharaoh's response is to say, okay, all you Hebrews, taking away your property and your rights, you're going to be slaves, you're going to work. And there's this terrible suffering as the Hebrew people are quite dramatically thrown into slavery, and they cry out to God. And the story of Exodus is the story of God sending them a deliverer in Moses. And you can read all about this in the book of Exodus. And whenever we think of Moses, of course, many of us of a certain generation see him always as Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. So when was this? When did the Exodus take place? Well, again, there's no Egyptian records of Israel during this period, so we're not exactly sure. For a long time, people thought it was the 15th century BCE. There was some reference to Habiru. There are some evidence by the 13th century of some Jewish or Semitic names and words coming into Egypt. So little clues, hints, but nothing definitive. Currently, scholars think that the Exodus probably happened most likely in the 13th century BCE, perhaps in the reign of Ramses II, that good-looking guy in the picture on our slide. And he reigned from 1290 to 1224 BCE. The story of the Exodus, of course, Moses, after the plagues of Egypt, is finally let go by Pharaoh, and they cross the Red Sea. Now, this is an interesting thing. I wanted to highlight this because this is one of those areas where history can be a little confusing. So in the story of the crossing of the Red Sea, which takes place in Exodus 14, the Hebrew term for the crossing was Yam Suf, and this is traditionally thought to have been the Red Sea. But actually, remember we mentioned last month that the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in Egypt, the Septuagint, and there's in that translation from Hebrew to Greek, and then from our translation from Greek to English, there was an error made, according to many scholars. And in fact, the word suf, if it's Yam Suf, the word suf does not mean red, but instead it means reeds, like the reeds you'd see in a marshland, right? So instead of the Red Sea, it's the Sea of Reeds. And that means it may have happened in actually a different place. That what we've always thought, and our picture again from the Ten Commandments, we saw the big walls of water, and the fish swimming on either side and the people crossing over. Well, it may not have happened exactly like that, according to this scholarly view of the translation. In fact, we're not entirely sure when this happened or where it happened or how it happened. We have the story from Exodus, and we base our historical knowledge on that. We do know that there was this time of slavery, right? Time of prosperity in Egypt, then a time of slavery, and then eventually the people leave, and wander for a generation in the wilderness. Where did they wander? Again, no details about the locations where they wandered. And so, how do we figure this out? Well, a fascinating story. So, a lot of our knowledge about the Holy Land and the places where Jesus ministered and lived come to us because of one person, Helena, who was the mother of the Emperor Constantine. He's the one who moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, well, Byzantium, and then he renamed it after himself, Constantinople. His mother was fascinated. Constantine converted to Christianity. His mother, Helena, was a Christian, and she made a trip to the Holy Land, in fact, several trips. And she was investigating. She wanted to know, where did these events happen? Where was the crucifixion and resurrection? Where was Jesus born? And so, as she traveled around, she would ask the local people where these events happened, and she would put churches. She built churches on the sites, and that's how we know where those events happened, at least where she thought they happened, where the people of the time. Again, it was a few hundred years after the actual events, but it's our best kind of understanding. So she was asking, where were the Ten Commandments given, right? Where was this Mount Sinai? And she talked to an Egyptian pilgrim, or she had heard about this Egyptian pilgrim named Ammonius, who had visited the area, and he identified a mountain called Jebel Musa as the mountain where Moses received the Ten Commandments. And in fact, there were a group of monks who were living there, and they also said, "Oh yeah, this was the place." And the local Bedouins said, "Oh yeah, that's we know from our oral tradition that that's where all this happened." So that's where she picked as the site for that event to happen. And also, she said she received that in a dream, and so she knew that was it. It's possible it was another site. Some scholars think it could have been as far away as Petra in Jordan, that lovely kind of relief carving on the cliff wall that you've seen maybe in Indiana Jones, or even in a volcano in the Arab Peninsula. There's all kinds of speculation. It's very hard for us as modern historical people to definitively say when and how and where these things happened. Another key part of the history of the Hebrew Bible is a whole set of books following this, which are lumped together in the umbrella term of Deuteronomic history. Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Bible. It means second law, and it's the book of the law that was discovered or written by Josiah, and we'll talk about him in a minute, one of the kings of Israel. But the Deuteronomic history covers much more than just the book of Deuteronomy. It is a source that underlies many books of the Bible, including Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and also some parts of the prophet Jeremiah. All of these are historical writings, and we know a little bit about the Deuteronomic historian because of the way they write. There's a kind of point of view, there's a theology that is very, very clear in this writing. This is a person who really believed in black and white thinking, either or. This is how it is. And so Joshua, the book of Joshua, is depicted as a grand, divinely guided conquest. God just unfolded this. Judges, we'll see in a second, is a cycle of the people being in trouble, God rescuing them, and then they fall back into trouble. And then the story of the kings, as a few good kings, but most of them did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and were punished. And so you see this very moralistic view of history in the Deuteronomic histories that we read. For me, the most difficult of these books is the book of Joshua. It's probably written in the 6th century BCE. It's set many centuries earlier, right after the Exodus, right? Because Moses and the people had to wait for a whole generation. They all had to die. And then it was Joshua who's appointed to lead the people into the promised land. Even Moses, for all of his greatness, was not considered worthy to enter the promised land. And so Joshua tells the story of that next generation after the time of wilderness. But it's difficult to confirm, right? These events are way, way back in the past. There's no archaeological evidence. Like none of the places in Canaan ever refer to these Hebrews coming and conquering them. Right? There's no Merniptah Stele. There's nothing corroborating this story, fascinatingly. And for me, the deeper question is how to reconcile the story of Joshua, the book of Joshua, with our understanding of God as a God of justice and mercy. Joshua is a book of genocide and ethnic cleansing. In Joshua, God commands the Hebrews, the Israelites, to slaughter every man, woman, and child of the Canaanites and to burn or destroy all of their property. In fact, when they get in trouble in the book of Joshua, it's because they kept some of the women or some of the property and didn't destroy it all, didn't kill everybody. And so God gets very upset. This is very troubling in a time when we have seen in the 20th and 21st centuries many sad uh, episodes of genocide and ethnic cleansing, hatred. This is a very problematic book for us to wrestle with. It's also been used in recent years to justify the claims of some of the extremist Zionists in Israel. Netanyahu, it's interesting, in the current government, never wanted to include the far-right zealots in his cabinet. He always kept them out of the government. But in the recent election, he was desperate to get reelected. He's under indictment, and so staying in power was a way to stay out of jail. And so he was willing to take any help he could get. And so a couple members of his cabinet are from the extreme religious zealotry of Israel. And some of them have said publicly that they want to drive every Palestinian out of Israel, right? The people that it's in a way eerily similar to the book of Joshua. There are these people living in the land who are not Jews. And so Joshua comes in and says they all have to go. We can either kill them or we can export them. They can leave. That's in some ways what some of the rhetoric of a few people in Netanyahu's cabinet is also saying. So to me, there are real world consequences to the way that we read and understand this history, and sometimes in very difficult and problematic ways. The next book after Joshua is Judges, and we get about 15 different judges. They're a fascinating group of leaders. Again, they're raised up by God to save the people. Deborah, a woman, is one of them. We get the story of Samson. If you remember him, his power came from his hair somehow. As a Nazarite, he got spiritual power from long hair. I always think of get a haircut and get a real job, but for him it was don't get a haircut and you'll keep your job as a judge. And then the last of these is the great prophet Samuel. And those stories are really interesting to read. The pattern is exactly the same for all 15 judges. Israel does what is evil in the sight of God. The people are given into the hands of their enemies. They're conquered by these neighboring kingdoms. They're oppressed. They cry out to God. God raises up a judge. The Spirit of God comes upon the judge. It gives that leader the power to defeat the enemy, often in miraculous ways. Peace is regained. The people are happy. And then they're back to doing evil again, rinse and repeat over and over. That's the Deuteronomic historian's very moralistic view of the history of that period. Kind of interesting to read. At the end of that period, the people are really clamoring for a king. They look around at all the other kingdoms and like they all have kings. We feel like we're second class because we don't have a king. And they call out to Samuel, this last of the judges and one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. And Samuel says to them in chapter 8, you don't know what you're asking for. He said, a king is going to take your sons to be soldiers, going to take your daughters to be in the palace. He's going to charge taxes. He's going to oppress you. You really want to think twice about this. You don't know how good you've had it with these judges. And the people are like, nope, we want a king. And so God and Samuel relent, and Saul is anointed as the first king in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 1. Saul is a Benjaminite. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. He spends most of his time fighting the Philistines, and he ends up having what we might call today paranoid schizophrenia, and he loses his the favor of God and the people, and eventually he's killed in battle, and David becomes the new king. David continues that work, expanding the kingdom through warfare and conquest. His reign is marred by civil war. His son Absalom rebels against him. There's a very difficult battle. Absalom is killed, and it's David's son by Bathsheba, the whole other story, Solomon, who becomes the new king. And these three, Saul, David, and Solomon, are reigning over a united kingdom. So Israel is whole at that point. And then after Solomon, the kingdom gets divided. All of this is captured in a part of I think one of the most important parts of the history in the Hebrew Bible, which is called the court history. These are the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and they're written by someone very close to the events. Unlike Genesis, where these stories were oral traditions for centuries, this history is written by someone who was there, right? Someone who was either a court scribe in David's court or more likely in Solomon's court, writing down this court history. And so it has the quality of almost like eyewitness, right? You get much more, it just reads very differently as you see details that are lacking in some of the other stories. And this tells the story of Saul, who reigned from 1050 to about 1000, who was in continuous war with the Philistines and other tribes. David, who reigns from 1000 to 961. Again, his whole saga of expanding the kingdom. And then Solomon, who inherits a peaceful kingdom. The warfare is basically ended by then. And so he has the peace and prosperity to build the temple. So the first temple gets built during this period. Well, at the end of Solomon's reign, the country is split. There is another struggle over who's going to inherit. And so eventually, two kingdoms are set up. Rehoboam becomes the king of Judah in the south. That's where Jerusalem is. You can see on the map. And then Jeroboam becomes the king of Israel in the north. And the two are never really united again. There's a couple versions of this history. 1st and 2nd Kings tells the story from the perspective of Jerusalem, the southern kingdom, and Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, is a similar version. It's the same story basically, but told from the perspective of the northern kingdom of Israel. And we see that in the Hebrew Bible, that there are these different traditions. Things are remembered differently in the north than they are in the south. I always wondered what a textbook would look like in, let's say, Alabama about the Civil War in America, as opposed to like in Michigan or New York, right? We remember things differently. The timeline of this divided kingdom, we won't go into all the details of all the different kings. It gets very confusing. You almost need a chart to keep track of who was king in Israel, who was king in Judah. From 922, when the kingdom splits, to 722, there are these two kingdoms, but we see foreign powers growing in influence and power. And so in 722, the Assyrian Empire conquers the northern kingdom of Israel and ends its existence as an independent state. That's the end of the kingdom of Israel in the north. The 10 tribes, remember Jacob had 12 sons, 10 of the tribes had settled in that part of the kingdom, and they disappear from history, basically. Judah in the south hangs on for another 140 years or so, but they also succumb to conquest. So it's fascinating to read the stories of the Southern Kingdom, because they're a vassal state, like they're paying tribute to different kingdoms, Syria or Egypt, and then eventually, when the Assyrian Empire collapses, the Babylonian Empire takes over, and eventually they come and conquer Judah, and they also are ended as an independent state in around 586 or 587. During this period, we get the great prophets, right? So in the north, in Israel, there's Elijah, who is the lone voice of dissent against evil King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and it's a very dramatic story of Elijah. He hands on to his successor, Elisha, the reigns of the prophet. And then we have other prophets like Amos and Hosea, Jonah. You see him being swallowed by the fish there, and Nahum. In 722, the fall of Israel happens because of anarchy within the northern kingdom. And then again, as I mentioned, the expansion of the Assyrian Empire with their emperor Tiglath-Pileser. I love those Assyrian names. He had also the name Shalmaneser. You can read about this in 2 Kings 17. And this stone depicts some of that conquest. Kind of interestingly, we have a picture of the on the top part there. You can see the trying to find my notes here. This is a relief from Tiglath-Pileser's palace in Nimrud, his capital city. It shows the conquest of Galilee in 732 BC and shows Jews being taken as prisoners. So they're carrying all their belongings. The policy of these ancient empires was not to kill everyone, but to export them, basically take the leaders of the people and scatter them throughout the empire. So they couldn't band together and create a rebellion. And so many of the Jews were left in Israel, but they had no access now to their leaders, to their religion. Anyone who was a religious leader or a civil leader was scattered and exiled to the four corners of the Assyrian Empire. And here's a picture of them being exiled after this conquest. So Judah hangs on, as I mentioned, for a while. They're a vassal state. They're making alliances with different countries. The Assyrian Empire collapses in 612 through internal politics and dynamics. For a brief window, there's sort of a little golden age for Judah. They regain independence under King Josiah. And King Josiah, according to the Deuteronomic, that moralistic history, is the greatest of all the kings of Judah because he instituted religious reform. He recovered or wrote the book of Deuteronomy, the book of the law. He destroyed the idols, and he renews the covenant with God. He brings people back to faithfulness. And according to the Deuteronomic history, that is when God is pleased with the people and rewards them. But it doesn't last. When Josiah dies, Judah again has a king who did evil in the sight of Yahweh, and they become a subject state of Egypt. Now, since the Assyrian Empire had collapsed, the Babylonian Empire has taken over their territory. They have a new emperor, Nebuchadnezzar, who defeats the Egyptians, and he marches through their territory, including Palestine. He makes Judah a vassal state, but then conquers them in 597 in one of the big turning points of Jewish life. So think of some big turning points. The call of Abraham, when he followed and became the ancestor of the Jewish people. We think of Moses and the Exodus, the time of wilderness and the coming into the promised land, another pivotal moment. And now we get another one, the first, the destruction of Israel in 722, and now the destruction, the fall of Judah in 597. This becomes a critical moment for the people of Israel to have to rethink their life. The events of the fall of Judah are described in Jeremiah 39. Basically, the agents of Nebuchadnezzar come and they take the king Zedekiah of Judah out of the city with his sons, and it's very cruel. They murder his sons in front of him and then blind him. So his last sight on earth is the death of his children, and then they exile him to the Babylonian Empire. This was cataclysmic for not only for Zedekiah, but also for all the people of Israel, because the temple is destroyed, the king is exiled, all the leaders, again, the same idea, are shipped out to four corners of the Babylonian Empire. And there's a real question: how are we going to be God's people when we have lost everything that makes our life have meaning? This theological question is answered by a number of great figures of Judaism. The psalmist who writes Psalm 137, this absolutely gorgeous psalm, really talks about the lament of the exiled people of Israel. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. Our tormentors asked us for a song, but how could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? How can we be Jews in Babylon? We have no temple. We have no priests. We have no leaders. We have no king. How are we going to do this? And this crisis leads to tremendous theological insight, development, and ferment, and becomes really a huge part of Jewish life going forward. What they had was the Torah, the book of the law that they had brought with them. What they had was the ability to pray and worship. And so they kind of reinvent their religion as that covenant relationship with God, now centered not in the temple, but in the words of the Torah, which is not fully formed yet, but they've got these scriptures that they can recite and remember and pray together. Another way to look at this is in the book of Isaiah, one of the most important books for the New Testament. It's the most often quoted book in the New Testament from the Hebrew Bible is the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is probably written by three different authors. The first section is the words of the prophet Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39. It includes things like the vision in the temple, which is full of smoke, and the holy, 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 right? That's all from first Isaiah. But this second section, and that's written before the conquest of Babylon, right? So the fall of Judah. So a lot of those chapters are warning about what's going to come. Bad things are going to happen. So first Isaiah is bad things are going to happen. Second Isaiah is after the fall of Judah. And so it's bad things have happened. And now what? It's the work of an anonymous 6th century author, as far as we know, who is writing from Babylon and reflecting theologically on what is going on with the people. How are we going to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And it is second Isaiah who comes up with some key insights that including the first full statement of monotheism, that there is no other God but God. And then third Isaiah is after the restoration. So after they return to Israel, to Palestine, and so you get chapters 56 to 66. So the book of Isaiah is a wonderful way to kind of bracket this whole phase of history from before the exile, and then the restoration. So the message that second Isaiah comes up with is, again, this belief in monotheism, that Yahweh, our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is the only God and is the sovereign Lord of history. Everything that happens is under God's purview. So if we're going through a hard time, we need to think about that in terms of how God is using us to bear witness to God's greatness, even in the midst of suffering. Israel is now seen as the suffering servant, okay? So those wonderful passages that we apply as Christians to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we read them in Holy Week. They're really written first to apply to the whole nation of Israel, which is suffering through this conquest in order that God's greatness might be made known. And God's greatness is made known, according to second Isaiah, by, of all unlikely people, the emperor of Persia, yet another empire. So Assyrian Empire, Babylonian Empire, now the Persians rise up and they defeat the Babylonians in battle. And Cyrus, the Persian king, sends the Israelites back to Israel, sends the Hebrews back home. And so second Isaiah refers to him as the Messiah, the one anointed by God to save and restore the people of Israel. What a radical idea that a Gentile Persian king could be given the name of Messiah in this way, because he's the one who restored the people to their homeland. All of this, I want to say, is the theological work of someone who is trying to understand life in faith during a very difficult time, and it creates this incredible creativity and ferment. Some of the best and most important theology of the Hebrew Bible comes out of this terrible time of exile. After the restoration, after Cyrus defeats the Babylonians in 538, after he restores the leaders of the Jewish community, remember a lot of people had stayed, but the leaders come back. This is now written about in the book of Ezra. It takes years to rebuild. All the hostile neighbors had kind of moved in and set up shop. The people who were there, the Jews, had intermarried and kind of lost their way as Jews. Out of this time comes more prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, who begin to look forward to, like if Cyrus was a Messiah, now we're sort of looking forward to the Messiah who's going to reinstitute the permanent and eternal kingdom of Israel as a glorious manifestation of God's reign on earth. There's urgency to restoring the temple. That gets finished around 515, so it's rebuilt. The original Solomon's temple is rebuilt. That's depicted in the book of Ezra. The governor Nehemiah is sent to Jerusalem about 440, and he begins the process of securing the territory, rebuilding the walls, and trying to kick out some of the people who had moved in. And then Ezra, the priest, is sent in 428, around then, to restore Israel's religious practice, right? To bring people back. Now we got the temple. Now we're recovering a sense of our identity. Now we need to reintroduce the way that we're supposed to worship and to live, which had gotten lost during this time of exile. And so he reads the law to the people. They weep because they're so glad to be restored to the traditions of their forebears. Following this comes what we call the Hellenistic period. It's really begun in some ways by Alexander the Great, who's yet another conqueror. So if you think of the people of Israel, it's just waves of conquerors, right? There's the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, now the Macedonians. So Alexander was a Macedonian prince who became the greatest conqueror of his time, legendary for spreading Greek, Macedonian, basically Greek, it's right nearby, Greek philosophy and culture and language all throughout the ancient world as far as India and Europe. In Egypt, General Ptolemy is in charge of ruling Palestine, and it's during this time that Greek-speaking Jews in Egypt, so this is how cosmopolitan things have gotten, produce the Septuagint, that's the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. And then another group called the Seleucids control Palestine after Ptolemy, and this emperor Antiochus Epiphanes is a great enemy of the people of Israel in the Bible. The story is told in the book of Maccabees, but he aggressively promotes Greek culture, language, and religion to the extent of wanting to stop all Jewish worship in the temple. And so he slaughters a pig, an unclean animal, on the altar of the temple. And boy, did the Jewish people of the area not like that. We see a response to that in the writings of the book of Daniel, which tells sort of the story of this. The second half of Daniel is apocalyptic literature, like this is the end of the world happening here. And a lot of that imagery gets carried on into the book of Revelation later on. There's a revolt against this Seleucid king Antiochus, and the Maccabees become the great Jewish heroes and rise up and actually take control of Jerusalem in from 167 to 160 BC. You can read about that in the story of the Maccabees. That's when they restore the temple. They're they put oil in the lamp to light it, but there's only enough for one day, but it lasts for 8 days. That becomes the holiday of Hanukkah, which is the miraculous 8-day lighting of that torch, of that lamp, with only enough oil for one day. The Maccabees' rule ends when Rome, the next in the series of conquerors, comes. This is recorded by Josephus. I mentioned him, a Jewish historian who writes in the 1st century a book called The Wars of the Jews, and he tells the story from the outside of the Bible about what was going on. It began with a civil war between two of the Maccabee kings, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, and eventually Pompey the Great comes and lays siege to Jerusalem, and he takes over and then appoints subject kings, the Herods. And so Herod the Great reigned from 41 BC to 4 BC, about then, was responsible for rebuilding and expanding the Second Temple. So he kind of creates this new version of the temple. He's also probably the Herod who ordered the massacre of the innocents at the time of the birth of Jesus. Calendars are weird, so it's possible that Jesus was born in around 3 or 4 BC, which is odd that Jesus would be born 4 years before the birth of Christ. But that's the way calendars get kind of confusing. That's another complicated part of history. Herod the Great is succeeded. His kingdom splits into two. They can't decide. And so Herod Archelaus and Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas becomes the Herod that we read about in the New Testament, the stories of John the Baptist, his beheading, and also the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus. That's all happening in this time of Roman conquest and puppet kings, the Herods, Herod the Great and Herod Antipas. This century is really fascinating because so much is going on. It's really a pivotal period in human history and also in religious history, because Judaism is being recreated at this time as well. Just like during the exile, Jews had to figure out, how are we going to worship God without the temple? How are we going to worship God without our homeland? The same thing happens in 70 of the Common Era. The Romans destroy Jerusalem and the Second Temple. And the temple has never been rebuilt. All that's left now is the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, that you can go to as a pilgrim and put prayers into. Up on the top, there is now a mosque, because that's a holy site for Islam. So Jews have to figure out, how are we going to recreate our religion yet again? Based on the experience of the exile, they already had a way to forward, which was basically to reorganize away from temple sacrifice and towards the study of the Torah. And so the leaders of religious Jews now become rabbis, teachers, who instruct the people in the Torah, in the Bible, and lead the prayer services. The home and the synagogue now become the center of Jewish worship. But it was a complete revolution in their thinking. They also then have to codify their Bible, as we saw last month. It's this time, around 90 of the Common Era, that a final official version of the Hebrew Bible is compiled, so that they have something that they can base their new version of Judaism on. It's also the creation of the Christian movement, right? So we see this first century as the time of the writing of the New Testament, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and then the writing of those events, the letters of Paul, etc., all takes place in the first century. So it's hard to overstate the importance of this moment in human history. So the New Testament basically is written in this way. The letters of Paul are the first written parts of the New Testament, roughly 48 to 64 of the Common Era. As the new Christian church is expanding into Asia Minor, Paul and others are founding these churches, and then Paul's trying to keep them together and on the right track by writing letters. They didn't have email, so he had to rely on letters and visits. And these letters are fascinating because they reflect the growing pains of this new Christian church. And Paul, in the midst of solving problems in these churches, is also creating a theological framework for the followers of Jesus. He's answering questions. What do we believe about resurrection? What about marriage? What about marriage to unbelievers? What about how Gentiles are? Can they come into the church, or is it just circumcised Jews? He has to answer all these questions, and in doing so, he lays the foundation for what we now think of as Christian theology. The first gospel to be written is Mark, around 70 of the Common Era, right around the time of the destruction of the temple. The Matthew and Luke are written around 15 years later in different communities with slightly different emphases. We see that in the four Gospels. Acts, which is Luke part 2, if you never knew that, Acts is really a continuation of the Gospel of Luke, but now the story of the early church. That also handles controversies like how we're going to welcome these new Gentile converts. Um, and then John is the last of the Gospels, somewhere around 100 of the Common Era, or maybe even later, and reflects a new problem that for a while Christians were going to synagogue in the morning and being with their Jewish brothers and sisters. Then on Sunday, they were gathering for communion. And by 100, the Christians have largely been expelled from the synagogues as being heretical. They're no longer considered, kosher. And so there's some bitterness. So some of the anti-Semitism that we see in John is probably just a reaction to this messy divorce between Jews and their Christian brothers and sisters. All right, that's a lot of history. We've covered from 9000 BCE to 100 CE in a very short time. Maybe it doesn't seem that short to you, but what are the key takeaways? So for me, these are some of the things I hope you'll bring away from this class. And again, I welcome your questions as we go forward. While the Bible contains a tremendous amount of history, it's important to remember that it's not written primarily as a factual history, right? We were talking about that with Genesis, but rather, this is a record of God's relationship with humanity. The writers weren't so concerned with getting the factual details right. They were concerned with getting the spiritual, moral, and ethical ideas across for posterity. The Hebrew Bible also records the gradual development of the identity of the people of Israel. Over time, they begin to see themselves as a people set apart by God for a purpose. And one of the things that carries into the New Testament is this idea that Israel was chosen not because of their intrinsic worth, like not because they were better than everybody else, but because they could be a light to enlighten the nations, the whole world, that by God choosing this one tribe of people to be his special kind of experiment to inculcate them with this idea of faithfulness and covenant and mercy and justice, that they could then reflect that to the wider world. And that becomes a critical self-identity for Jews. While the people were influenced, the Hebrew people, by all the neighboring cultures and religions, Israel at the same time develops a unique moral and religious identity, this idea of monotheism, which continued to evolve and grow through the centuries. Similarly, in the New Testament, we see a development of Christian thought in the first decades of the church's existence. For example, the first Christians thought Jesus was going to return imminently, right? They thought it was going to be in their lifetimes, maybe even a shorter time than that. So don't worry about getting married. Don't worry about having property. Get rid of everything because this is all going to happen right away. Well, by the later books of the New Testament, we're starting to see a development of things like church structure. Hey, we got to figure out how to do this now. So you see things like bishops and deacons, and then eventually priests. You see questions about how are we going to continue on, because it looks like Jesus has delayed his second coming. And as I mentioned, the Gospels kind of reflect the different priorities of those Christian communities as well. We see different emphases in Mark, in Matthew, and Luke, and in John. Same Jesus, same stories basically, but with a slightly different focus and emphasis. Finally, and this is my big takeaway, I think that knowing the history behind the text is not only important, but really essential for correctly understanding and interpreting these ancient sacred texts. Taking stories out of context. For example, Paul in 1 Corinthians tells a group of women to be silent and to cover their heads in church. And so some Christians were like, therefore, women may never speak in church or lead, and they must always cover their heads. When I was a kid, women would still wear hats in church. Sometimes it became a way of showing off their hats, but it really went back to this teaching of Paul in 1 Corinthians. Well, we have to ask ourselves, was Paul meaning that teaching for all women, for all time, everywhere, in every place, be quiet and wear a hat? Or Was he speaking to a particular specific problem that was going on in the church in Corinth? Was it something related to a specific time and place, or was it something that is for all time? Those are questions that we can get a better answer to when we understand the context and the history that was going on in and behind the story of the text. It's why churches like the Episcopal Church have been willing to make changes to allow women to have a full voice and participation in the life of the church, including becoming priests and bishops and even presiding bishop, because we believe that that teaching of Paul was not meant to be a universal teaching for all time and all place. Other Christians disagree. I invite you to do this kind of reflection. I thank you so much for your patience and willingness to go along on this journey. And I invite you to join us for our future classes in the Bible 101. God bless.